Everyone to this One Future Autumn Series webinar on climate campaigning. What's next after the success of the climate law campaign that finished in the summer when the climate bill finally became law? We're looking ahead to what's happening over the next few months. And joining me tonight on the panel, I'm just going to say your names and you're going to say just a few words about who you are and what you do, is Ciara Murphy. Dr. Ciara Murphy. You there, Ciara?
Sorry. So I'm Ciara. I work with the Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice as the environmental policy advocate. That's me.
Conor O'Neill.
Hi everyone, I'm Conor O'Neill. I work for Christian Aid Ireland, which is an international aid and development organisation which works around the world to alleviate poverty, working with people of all faiths and none.
And Jerry.
Hi everyone, I'm Jerry McEvely. I'm I can still say new head of policy in Friends of the Earth. I am, for those of you who have been involved with this for a while, I am the new Kate Ruddock, hopefully living up to Kate Ruddock's high expectations. And I apologies if I ruined your poll, Oisín. It's a bad start.
I probably would have made a Hames with myself. Maybe I did, so maybe just thanks, Jerry. So each of my panelists will say we'll talk for about 5 minutes about a particular area, and I'll introduce that as we go along. But before that, I know I've already been talking a bit. I'm going to talk very briefly about the bit that Siobhan O'Neill might be talking about if she was still with us, and that's just the lie of the land, the major governmental policy decisions around climate that are coming up in the next few months, just to give ourselves the background. And these basically flow directly from the climate law that was passed in the summer, and they're not going to happen in perfect sequence this year because of the fact that the law only got passed in the summer and the government's kind of playing catch up on what it planned to do. So the government now has, as you know, a climate action plan. The last one was in 2019, and that's supposed to come out every year under the law. I see Clive saying she's still very much alive and with us, but she doesn't have to do this right now anyway. So the government will be updating the climate action plan to reflect the increased ambition in the programme for government, and that ambition now being reflected in the law itself. So basically it's a doubling of the speed with which we're going to reduce emissions. In theory, that's the plan. And so we will see from government this autumn. They say they'd like to have it out before the budget, the fiscal budget, the money budget on the 12th of October. That's getting tight already, but that is their stated ambition. And that will lay out all the new policies and measures and the existing policies and measures that the government will be undertaking to reduce emissions across all sectors: agriculture, transport, buildings, tax, everywhere. And that is the thing that we were all doing those consultation submissions on back in May. And that's going to be a big moment, and it's going to make climate policy more tangible than anything else has, because thanks to all of you, you all got stuck into the weeds of legislation and legislative process. But for most people, that's very abstract. Whereas this really will be about electric cars, retrofitting, agricultural practice, renewable electricity, fossil fuels, things that are far more tangible to our everyday lives. So it should be an opportunity to engage the public more generally in a way that they're only been engaged superficially so far in the need for action, in the understanding of there's a threat. But this will be far more resonant with the general public, I think. And of course, the plan itself is only the start of it, because then comes all the implementation of that plan over time, and ultimately then the accountability in a year's time when the Climate Council reports on progress and the government has to produce a new version of the plan. But just to give you one taster, we know there was a government decision to increase funding for cycling and walking, and there's been some really positive examples of that. But you've also probably seen places where local businesses and some local residents have objected to new cycle laneways. And that's just one example of one small policy area where it's one thing even to make positive change at national government level. It's another thing to have it actually happen on the ground, and then does it actually reduce emissions? So there's still a lot of steps to go. But in some ways, that's going to be the biggest climate moment of the next few months, albeit one that, while it's mandated by the law, it isn't a new thing. We have had climate action plans before, so it won't necessarily feel all that new as a kind of experience. But hopefully it'll be far more jam-packed with good policies than we've ever had before. That if they're going to meet the the targets in the law, and of course they are required to try to meet the targets in the law with the plan. That's what the law requires. And then there's a few more, and I'll be even briefer about these. There are a few more moments that flow directly from the law and which are new. So the law set a 2050 target, and it set a 2030 target of 51% reductions by 2030, which is very challenging, albeit still not our fair share. But that has to get broken down into 2 5-year targets called carbon budgets. So it won't be expressed simply as how much of the reduction by 2025 or 2030. It'll be expressed in how much pollution we can emit in those 5-year periods, which is why it is somewhat confusingly called a budget. It's not anything to do with money. It's not to do with the carbon tax, but it is a budget in the sense of it is how much pollution we can emit over a given period, in the way a budget, normally speaking, when it comes to money, is how much money you can spend over a given period. That's the analogy that made us choose that phrase very many years ago. Although when it comes within weeks of the fiscal money budget, it's a bit confusing. And the steps around that will be that the Climate Action Council, which has these new powers, doesn't yet have all its members, still missing some crucial regulations that will guide its work, but it's due to come up with its proposal for what our 5-year target should be, the carbon budget to 2025, and the second 5-year period to 2030, what that number should be. It's due to do that. Well, the government had said last week, the Minister Ryan said he hoped that it would be before the end of the month. It will not be before the end of the month because they haven't got all their members yet, and they haven't got the regulations from government yet. But I imagine it'll be in October. So it'll come after it may well come after the Climate Action Plan, which is a bit strange. People may find it a bit strange, but actually this is for 5 years. This will only happen once every 5 years, and it has to go through a process in the Dáil, because something we fought hard for in the climate law was not just that the government just wouldn't decide these, even on the basis of expert advice on its own, that it would get voted on by the Dáil and Seanad, so that all parties, the whole Parliament, our elected representatives, buy into our 5-year target to make them really robust and have cross-government and cross-governments buy in if the government changes it. As well, there will be an election before this budget finishes, so we want to make sure the next budget the next government feels equal ownership of that target. So that will happen between now and Christmas. It's a 2-month period where the carbon budget goes through a process in the Dáil and may go to committees, etc., before it's actually voted on and accepted, and it can go back and forth between government and the Oireachtas for a couple of months. So I would say that it has to be done by Christmas probably, but it may not be done before that, which is why it's not the end of the world that it comes after the Climate Action Plan, because it lasts for 5 years and there'll be a new action plan next year. So the next year's action plan can be responding to pick up any slack between this year's plan and the budget. The other aspect, the budget is just the overall number for the whole economy, for the whole of society. And at the moment, and I won't use very many numbers, but at the moment, we emit 60 million tonnes per year, roughly speaking, in Ireland. That's 300 million tonnes over 5 years. And if we're to meet the 2030 target and we go down in a straight line, linear line down, roughly speaking, the first 5-year budget should be 250 million tonnes rather than 300, which would be in a no change scenario. And the second 5-year budget should be 175 million tonnes. So it's a total of 425 roughly, as opposed to 600 roughly. That's our Friends of the Earth's position on what it should be. Whether it'll be quite as good as that it will remain to be seen, and we can delve into more into that as we go on. And it is an issue that may well be worth talking to TDs about in more detail in the coming months, because they will all have a vote on it. So they won't have a vote on what goes into the action plan. They might have opinions. They won't have a vote on what Ireland does at the UN conference in Glasgow, but they have a vote on the carbon budget. The other aspect, the final aspect of the kind of overall architecture, is that the government just doesn't decide that, the Oireachtas just decides that national pie, our emissions cake, our pollutions pie. Other analogies welcome. If you have a better idea in the chat box, please tell us. Carbon budget is confusing. Emissions cake, pollution pie, not so sure. But anyway, the next step is dividing up that emissions cake, dividing up that pollution pie into slices for each sector, and that's a government decision. So out of those 60 million tonnes, or that 250 over 5 years, how much goes to agriculture, how much goes to transport, how much goes to buildings, how much goes to electricity generation. And that's really where the rubber hits the road. It's where there'll be negotiations between the different departments and between ministers, and where we get the analogy with the fiscal budget, where departments compete for the slice of the overall spend of government. You want more for health, more for education. Who gets who gets what. And again, it's one of the main reasons why we pushed for this law for so long, because I'm not finished with this. This is the shift in dynamics we've been looking for, because over the course of the many climate action plans we've had over the last 20 years, in the year 2000, 2007, and 2017, and then 2019, over those four, what happened always was the Minister for the Environment would go to all the other departments and say, what can you do for me to cut emissions? And they go, not much. And they go, no, you have to do something. And they go, okay, here's a few things. And it would never add up to the target. And the industries that they represent, although of course departments shouldn't represent industries, would fight to do as little as possible. And the department would reflect that to the central ministry, to the Environment Ministry. And the Environment Ministry would never therefore get a plan that added up to our target. This time, the target is in law. It's done. It's dusted. It's not for negotiation. And then it'll be copper fastened in the form of a budget by the Climate Council and by the Oireachtas. So they are then no longer competing. They're no longer collaborating together to tell the Minister for the Environment to back off. They are competing with each other for a finite slice of the emissions pie, and that entirely changes the dynamic of climate policy making in Ireland, or it should do. That's the plan, and we've already seen some evidence of it in the Irish Farmers Association. Have stopped momentarily from giving out about environmentalists and Brazil, and are giving out about data centres and saying the data centres are going to take up too much of our carbon budget and would be unfair burden on the rest of society. That's exactly the dynamic we want, where we have Glanbia versus Cement Roadstone Holdings, as opposed to both of them against us. I shouldn't probably say that on a recorded session, but that's the truth of the dynamic we're looking for. And now that the law is passed, it's too late for that to be changed by anyone who might campaign against it. It's why we fought for it. That's why many people resisted it over many years. So that's what's the lie of the land at the sort of macro architectural top level of government, and how it begins to trickle down. So I'll introduce my colleagues now as we go along as to what they're. So I've talked about the national architecture. Conor is going to talk about the international architecture and the UN process in particular, and particularly the big climate conference in Glasgow in November, COP26. Conor, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Oisín. And also just to say, before looking at some of the content, that it is genuinely and sincerely so brilliant and heartening and excellent to see 60 plus people on this call. I really mean it, that the only reason that we have the climate bill, the only reason that the action that we've taken, limited as it may be, and we do have criticisms of how we need to be doing more, the only reason that's happening, the only reason there are TDs in the Dáil speaking about climate change more now than they ever have, is because there is this network of activists and an army of people around the country in every single constituency forcing them to do it. So genuine thank you to all the groups who have just moved mountains over the last number of years. And I hope that the number of people on the call tonight is a sign that there is plenty of energy and enthusiasm to keep going. Oisín gave a really good snapshot of what is happening nationally, but I wanted to speak briefly about the sort of international side of things, what's coming up, and crucially what we can do. And this is really why, development organizations like Christian Aid, who I work for, but also Trócaire, Oxfam, Concern, and others are founding and active members of Stop Climate Chaos, because, we know that climate change is ultimately a development issue and an issue of global justice at its heart. We see it every day in all of the countries in which we work, where many of the world's poorest communities who have done the least to cause the crisis are already dealing with its worst impacts, already at current levels of warming, battling rising sea levels, increased flooding, drought, and heat waves. These changes, they undermine food security, they drive hunger, and at the bottom line is that existing levels, high levels of humanitarian need are being exacerbated by climate change. And our ask, and in my view, our responsibility really as climate activists in the global north, is to demand that there is always a global justice and a fairness element in everything that we do here in Ireland. It is not just about what happens on this island. It's about asking, when we talk to politicians constantly, are we doing our fair share of the global effort? Are we putting our shoulder to the wheel in a way that's equitable? And are we stepping up to the mark? Ultimately, really, to try and boil it down, that means doing two things. First, it means reducing our emissions quickly. It's a question of ambition. It's a question of looking at our own historic emissions and rapidly and quickly getting them down so that other states, particularly poorer developing countries, have that more breathing room and time. The second thing then really is ensuring that poorer developing countries are receiving the support, particularly the financial support that they have been promised to help them adapt and respond to the changes that I already described. So these two criteria, getting our emissions down and getting the levels of support up, are what we need to do to sort of meet that the moral and ecological debt that we have as a high emitting country. So those two things, there are two places really in the coming months where that is crucially going to play out and happen. The first of those Oisín referenced is the COP Climate Change Conference in Glasgow in October. Now, I'm sure everyone has heard of this and is familiar with COP, but if you're not, COP essentially is the annual global climate summit where pretty much every country in the world, politicians and world leaders and civil society come together to debate how we should deal with the climate crisis. It was at COP21 in Paris in 2015, where we got the Paris Agreement, pretty much the overarching plan of action of how we're going to deal with climate change. And it's at successive yearly COPs where countries come together and do a stock take and assess, are we on course and what do we need to do to hit those targets? The unsurprising spoiler alert, unfortunately, is that we're not. We're very, very far off course. And there are key issues when it comes to ambition that Ireland needs to be championing when it goes to Glasgow in October. It's a crucial conference in that the equivalent last year was postponed because of the pandemic, and there's a real moment happening now internationally over, how do we respond? How do we build back better if we can put this pandemic behind us in the coming months and years? There are some key issues on the table as well that are existential for countries of the global south. For example, under the Paris Agreement and other successful agreements, wealthy high-emitting countries like Ireland promised and pledged to provide $100 billion per year in financial support to poorer countries to support them to adapt to a changing climate, to deal with what's happening. That target hasn't been met, and our individual contributions, by our analysis, are also too low. And that target is due to be revised upwards. That's something that we need to be advocating for. And separately, the Paris Agreement recognizes the importance of addressing loss and damage already associated with climate change. This has been one of the more controversial aspects of the agreement, and it is essentially a question of deciding how, if at all, to compensate vulnerable countries that are already feeling the impacts today. So those are two things that we are pushing for the Irish government and the Irish delegation to COP to emphasize and to push for action on, and we can share material on as well if people are interested. The second place then, I'll finish on this. So we have the COP at UN level, but there's also big flagship changes coming and happening at EU level. So over the last number of years, we saw the announcement of a so-called European Green Deal. The president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she called it Europe's man on the moon moment. And that pledged, among other things, to reach the so-called net zero position by 2050, and also crucially to cut emissions EU-wide by about 55% by the end of this decade, by 2030. What's coming in the next few months is a new climate law, essentially setting out how are we going to do it. They will be delivering what's called the Fit for 55, that target, the Fit for 55 package. And it's essentially 13 or 14 pieces of legislation, a big tranche of bills that look at new ways of how we make things using less materials, our energy production, how do we protect biodiversity, how does transport work across the European Union, how much money is giving to support a just transition, which Ciara will talk a little bit about, and so on and so forth. All of that is going to come over the next few months, and there'll be a series of moments starting in October when our Taoiseach or the relevant ministers and members of the Irish government will be in Brussels talking and debating how we do this. And what we need to do is we need to make sure, just how we're asking them to go to Glasgow, to the UN summit and push for greater ambition, we have to make sure that when 27 EU countries meet in Brussels, that Ireland is not one of the pack, as we have been in certain circumstances before, that is talking ambition down, that is seeking more flexibility, that is seeking us to do less. We have to make sure that the rhetoric that we hear on the news every evening now and that we hear in the Dáil, because of the work of groups like this, is reflected in what we say, not only in Dublin, but also in Brussels. So two things we can do, two places where it's going to happen over the next few months. And yeah, if I know that that's kind of a whistle stop tour. I wish we had more time, but if people have questions or comments or are looking for more material on anything, they're very happy to share. Thanks.
Thanks, Conor. Thank you very much. And the next person who will brief us is Dr. Ciara Murphy, who was introduced earlier, who's the environmental policy advocate, I think you said, Ciara, for the Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice.
Yeah.
Who will look at the kind of social challenges and implications of doing climate action fairly. Over to you, Ciara.
So thanks very much for having me. And I want to echo Conor in that it's amazing that so many people are choosing to sign into a webinar at 7 or 6:30 on a Tuesday evening when they are actually now allowed to go outside. So this webinar, as we know, is focusing on climate policies and campaigning opportunities over the next couple of months, but with social justice in mind, as well as with Conor in terms of international dimensions, looking at a national dimension, I suppose. It needs a wider point of view, I suppose. So climate justice and social justice, it's inseparable from housing, health, transport, inequality policies in Ireland and welfare as well. So in order for us to transition into a zero carbon society, everyone needs a solid footing, I suppose. So it's very hard to transition if you have insecure housing, or if you don't have childcare, or if you don't have the basics that you need for life. It is extremely hard to expect people to be able to, I suppose, transition into a completely different society, which we will need to do. So that's kind of what I want to focus on now over the next minute or two.
Want to share slides, Ciara?
No, I'm grand. It doesn't make a difference. So I think Conor mentioned a Green New Deal, and something we produced last year was we JCFJ produced a document on how a manifesto for a Green New Deal. So we were looking at how a Green New Deal might look in Ireland and how all of the policies might fit together. So it was more of a vision than a comprehensive set of policies, but I think we kind of need to look how it might fit together in order to see how the interactions work. So where I work in the Jesuit Centre, we don't just look at environmental issues, we look at penal policy, housing policy, economic ethics, and all of these things kind of make it, I suppose, easier to see where the connections lie and how one set of policies impact another. So the ones I want to look at in particular are I'm going to just cover 3 quick areas. So we all know that the climate bill was signed into law last year, and it was amazing, and it's brilliant that it's done. But one area where it does, I suppose, where it is kind of weak is just transition. So it is mentioned in the bill, but it is have regard to, which is fairly weak, and the just transition principles aren't, I suppose, defined well within the bill, and it does make it that it's not as strong as we would have hoped. So to try and remedy that, the Social Democrats have actually just introduced a just transition bill into the Dáil just in the last week, I think. And this bill was initially introduced in 2018 by the Green Party. So we know that there is people in the government at the minute who initially supported this, and whether it's and so whether this bill at the minute that's introduced isn't perfect, but it does look to I suppose safeguard the individuals and communities that would be impacted by climate action. So the ones that mainly come to mind are the people who work in the Midlands in peat production and that sort of stuff. So this bill would look to, I suppose, not just have the language around just transition, but to actually put it into legislation that people need to be protected. And just transition is an extremely important part of climate action, because you need to bring people along. It has to be fair. So there will be winners and losers, but you need to, I suppose, narrow the gap a bit. So it's not a perfect bill, I think I mentioned. It doesn't, I don't think any one piece of legislation can look at all the different vulnerable peoples and to stitch it into the one bill, but it is an extremely important, I suppose, vehicle by which we can have a conversation. And so that would be something that JCFJ anyway will be lobbying on in this, in the next coming weeks and stuff. So the next thing I want to talk about is something that's actually already happened. So we've, so recently there was the Housing for All policy was published, and this again might seem like it's not actually linked to climate policy, but housing is probably now it's a huge crisis in Ireland at the minute, and it is something that a lot of voters and a lot of people care a lot. It impacts everyone basically, and it's a huge social justice issue, and it does actually compete with environmental and climate, I suppose, public for public support. And they're not divergent, but if people were told to rank it, it has been. But it is important to remember that housing policy is climate policy. Housing policy or housing is an issue at the minute that it needs to be fixed, and it will be fixed because there's public or there's political momentum behind it. But we need to make sure it's fixed correctly so that it's not an issue that we'll have to like if we build a load of houses that in the wrong places and in the wrong way, it needs to complement climate action, and it can't, I suppose, take away from it. So an area that we need to look at is housing will be huge. So where we build our houses, how we build them, how we use our existing infrastructure, all of these things are so important. And the Housing for All policy actually has some quite good things in it. So there's the town centre first model, which looks to use existing infrastructure and tries to densify residential housing within towns and urban centres. That's a really good policy in terms of connecting up public transport links, and also decreasing the area that people need to travel to go to work and home. There's in this policy, there's also a commitment to retrofit all social homes, which is huge for reducing energy poverty within this cohort, and also reducing emissions at the same time. And it can be a model of how to do retrofitting quickly and well. And then there's also a requirement for all rental apartments or rental houses to have a minimum BER within a certain length of time. And this is huge because the rental accommodation is usually the worst quality housing. So bringing these up to par could make a big difference for the residential emissions. But it's also, it's really good, except it needs to be paired with protections for those people who are renting. Because if you have prices going past what's affordable, then that will be an issue in terms of where people can live and driving homelessness, I suppose, further. So there's a couple of issues in housing, but just to highlight that that's there. And then the next thing I want to look at is something that Oisín mentioned before. So the climate action plan will be huge. As Oisín mentioned, it's how we're going to do it. And so this plan will need to be very carefully looked at to make sure that there are just transition weaved into it, and that there's energy, like protections for the most vulnerable people needs to be in here. So if we look at how is the carbon tax going to impact people? How do we make sure that people in energy poverty are protected? And to make sure that the policies that are, I suppose, suggested don't just cater for the people who can afford it, that they are targeted towards people who, the less affluent people. So for an example, the million electric vehicles that we were aimed to have in the previous climate action plan, that doesn't do anything to help people who are less affluent reduce their emissions because people can't afford it. So having more equal access policies, such as access to better and cheaper public transport and safer active transport, is a more equal footing. So so basically they're the main things that we need to keep an eye on for the next little while. So I think if there's any questions, again, I can be more than happy to answer, but I'll pass it back to Oisín now.
So much, Ciara. I'm going to hand straight over to Jerry from Friends of the Earth, who will talk about the energy, so a bit more broader than pure climate policy, but the energy decisions and policies that are in play over the next couple of months. And I'm going to ask him to be more like Conor and less like me and Ciara, who we spoke for more than our 5 minutes. Certainly I did, because I'm conscious I want to have time for questions before Conor has to leave us at 8. So it's 18 minutes late now. So over to you, Jerry.
Okay, I will aim to finish at 19:47. We should put up a stopwatch. Okay, so first of all, some of the policy issues that I'm going to talk to you about. I am conscious that ye did a fantastic job at addressing some of the key actions that government needs to take place or needed to put in place as part of the Climate Action Plan consultations. So I am hugely impressed by your expertise and input, and I hope that continues. That's just an important point to start with. Second point is that everything I'm going to say links in with the Climate Action Plan and the carbon budget. So we need a ruthless focus on implementation, and the actions that I'm going to talk about flow from the Climate Action Plan and the carbon budget. So they're the architecture. So what are we doing on the energy side, as Oisín said? First of all, there's our No New Gas campaign, and there's two key elements to that. There's energy security review that's coming up next year, and that will involve public consultation, and that's a real opportunity for us to emphasize that fossil fuels need to stay in the ground and make a link between energy security and our climate commitments. And related but separate, we're going to be continuing our advocacy on LNG, on preventing LNG, on preventing fracked gas, and that's going to take various forms, including raising the profile of the government policy, which has introduced a moratorium on fracked gas imports. It's going to include action related to EU legislation, and we're also going to explore what other legislative opportunities there might be to introduce a more permanent type of ban or restriction preventing are related to LNG and fracked gas. And we still have a focus on offshore oil and gas exploration as well. And then I'll move on to our other Power to the People campaign. So we're continuing our policy and advocacy work on solar energy, particularly the need to remove the completely ridiculous planning restrictions on putting solar panels on roofs. That will also link in with the need to support more micro generation, like smaller generation, such as solar on people's houses and communities, and need for a proper support scheme. It'll include trying to support community energy, and it will also link in hopefully with a project that we'll have on trying to get more stakeholder involvement in our energy transition, and that's also linked to how we will Ireland will build out its electricity network. And and then the last thing I wanted to say is that we have one new exciting announcement that we're going to be significantly increasing our policy and advocacy on removing fossil fuels from your home. So that's that's not only the need for more retrofitting and the need for more heat pumps, but also the flip side of that. So what also needs to happen is that we need to remove oil and gas boilers from people's homes, but we need to do that in a very just way and taking into account the implications for people who are less vulnerable and need to support particularly retrofitting for those who are vulnerable to energy poverty. I have a bad feeling I've forgotten something, but that is the summary for the moment.
Great, thank you, Jerry, and thank you all three of you for covering such a wide variety of topics in such a short space of time. It does give everyone a taste of, in a funny way, the climate law was the easy part, as in it was I know we talked about many things along the way, but it was a very focused framework for climate policy. Now there are many paths and many issues on potential speed bumps on those paths. So it's much more like the process in May where we were talking about the different sectors. But thank you so much for doing a good job of summarizing. Now I mentioned at the beginning, but I meant to encourage people to be putting questions in the chat as we go along. And I know some people have. But now is the chance to either put a question in the chat, which you'll be able to see and respond to, or if you would like to speak a question, you can do that too by putting, I think the simplest way is by putting a star, because I can't see everybody, putting a star in the chat box. And I think just asterisks in the chat box, and I will then call on you. So do we have any questions? And actually, while people are putting this in, I see yours, Peter. I'll come to you in a second because you got left off last week by accident. Ciara, do you want to say a couple of words about the just transition resources, or is it covered in the chat box?
I think Elaine put Task have actually some very good just transition resources, and I think I can find the link and put them up, and I think I've put up the link for our Green New Deal one as well, so I'll just put them into the chat box.
I think Jerry's snapped on a snap at me. I was putting up an ILO link there. One thing is worth saying about just transition, there are kind of two not competing but complementary views of it. Trade unions and the ILO have a relatively defined, focused definition that is around like things like Bord na Móna. When fossil fuel workers are going to be put out of their jobs because of climate action, what should happen? There should be dialogue with the trade unions. There should be protection, etc., or compensation, or retraining, etc. There's the broad that's capital J, capital T, and the trade unions invented the term, and they feel relatively they want to make sure that bit's covered. And then there's the sort of fairness, the more broad fairness agenda that Ciara spoke about in the whole transition, making sure that we leave no one behind, the more sort of the ethos of the Sustainable Development Goals and a more just general climate justice approach. And that's covered by the whole range of things like Task and the Jesuit Centre and everybody else. But it is worthwhile remembering that at the core of just transition itself needs to be those concerns of workers who are affected if we're going to keep our climate movement as broad and participative as possible with everybody on board. Peter, I'm going to come to you first. Peter Lucy.
Hello, yes, thanks. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, thanks. Question for Conor, is it, from Christian Aid? I suppose global environmental injustice is why I'd be involved in anything. But I don't. How would you connect that to campaigning? Or actually, first question, would you have examples of, say, something that's happening directly on the ground, say, I don't know, in Africa or something like this is causing deaths because of our climate policies in Ireland? But my big question actually is, how would you campaign about that? How would you bring it up, or how would you talk about it, or how would you say it to a TD? By email or phone. How would you say I'm interested in climate justice, and I've never done that. I'm not sure how you would do that, how you talk about it, how you link it, and all that.
Conor, before you reply, because I'm conscious you might only get in once before you have to go to that full debate.
Apologies.
Romy and Sean Loughran, do you have questions that also relate to Conor's field, which is the more international? In which case, let's ask them now.
Mine is for Jerry.
Okay, you can hang on. So, Sean.
Yeah, I think mine. Well, I think it could be open for Conor. Anyway,
Fire us in there. So tell us.
Okay, I suppose my concern would be that in Fermanagh they're thinking of this plan and going for or I think fracking, and basically, is that something we should? I know it's over the border and it's not maybe our government, but it's something that we still need to be very concerned about, because at the end of the day, it's on the island of Ireland. We're talking about fracking, and these are something that could happen quite soon, like this planning. And
okay, thanks, Sean. I want to hand over to Conor. That question might actually be more one for Jerry. So Conor, don't feel you're on the spot to talk about fracking, although ChristianAid works north and south of the border.
Yeah, no, you're probably right. On the previous question from Peter, thanks a million. I think it's a really good one, and it's actually something that we hear a lot. Sometimes people are a little bit not surprised, but they see ourselves and Trócaire and Oxfam being so vocal about climate change or active in Stop Climate Chaos, and you have to try and make that link. I think the overwhelming thing I would say, as someone who spends pretty much all his time talking to TDs and trying to get them to do stuff, is not to be afraid to make that link more ambitious. Sometimes when people talk to TDs, they feel that they can only say, look, I need to talk about, if I'm talking to my local TD in County Wexford, it has to be about something pertaining to Wexford, about local people's lives. And obviously that's more common and important, but they also have a responsibility as some of the tiny few people, elected representatives in one of the wealthiest and most prosperous countries in the world, to be asked those bigger picture questions. And I think the way that I would always suggest putting it to them is, if they are they will be ready to talk to constituents now about climate action. What is Ireland doing? And I think the question we always have to put to them is, are we doing our fair share of the international effort? It's not just about, are we getting our emissions down, or how are we changing our own society and all of the things that Ciara and Oisín and Jerry talked about. It's, does that add up to a reasonable fair share of the global effort that's needed? When you look at the wealth in the country, when you look at our historic emissions profile, and the evidence by any reasonable metric, and there's some good resources I can share, is that we're not. The trajectory of getting our emissions down is too slow, and the level of financial support that we and other wealthy industrialized countries have been giving to poorer countries has been too low. So I think that's the context to give to a politician. For example, in 2015, Malawi was hit in a so-called once in 500 years flood. It impacted more than 1 million people. It displaced 300,000 people. It led to a devastating drought and a crop failure, and a state of emergency was declared, and extreme hunger. And all of that was at current levels of warming today. If you try and draw that link back, the average Irish person, based on the most recent figures that I have, emits about 100 times as much CO2 than the average person in Malawi. Now, it's not about trying to make it just about individual action, but it is about making that reference to the Irish government that we are a country, and I genuinely believe there's a strong level of support in Irish society for the role we've played internationally. We tend to be the one that tries to speak up for human rights, equitable development, fairness internationally. But one of the areas where we really are not walking the walk is climate action. Irish Aid is widely credited around the world as being one of the best at what it does, and I think people are proud of it. But our climate policy does not really align with our policies on development and aid and so on. So, in some, I think, put it directly to politicians when they say that we're doing climate action. Do they believe it's part of our fair share? And there's 2 or 3 areas, both our emissions and also on the financial support, that we can share some more material on that should be put to them, because they're only going to act on it if they're getting it on the doorstep, and not just from organizations and charities.
Great, thank you, Conor. Jerry, before you answer on fracking in the north, because Romy said her question was also for you, I'll let Romy come in.
Thank you, Oisín. Well, my question is actually, I think, perhaps the same one that Sean brought up, which was the issue of, I understand there's a license application in for fracking in the north. I understand that perhaps Sinn Féin have some legislation proposed whereby they want to ban fracking, but there's a likelihood the license application will be dealt with before the legislation could be passed. And I'm wondering, Jerry, is that something, now that's my understanding of what's happening, but is that something that the campaign will be concerned with?
I think there's two parts to that, Romy. I mean, first of all, on the particular dynamics of the license application and what's going on in Fermanagh, you may know more about the specifics than me, but we are linked with fracking activists in the north and do regularly exchange information with them. I think one definite opportunity here is, well, as you may know, there is a ban on fracking in Ireland and in Ireland, and then there is also now a policy statement on the importation of fracked gas. So there's an added dynamic of where would that fracked gas go if it involved any transfer into Ireland. So that moratorium, which on fracked gas imports, is going to be in place until an energy security review has been carried out. But I think we're very happy to, learn more about the dynamics of any new legislation that there might be at Stormont. I wasn't aware of that myself, but I think that would be quite helpful,
There are two climate bills in Stormont, one from all opposition parties, sorry, not all opposition parties, one from all parties bar the DUP, and one from the DUP minister. And our friends in Friends of the Earth in Northern Ireland are very active on those, and at least one of those may have a provision about fracking in it. I'm not sure. There are maybe other things going on up there around the legislative ban. I know that my colleagues in Northern Ireland are very confident that they will defeat fracking, that the campaign up there will defeat fracking. But obviously, it is something that we should be in solidarity with as much as possible, albeit that it's a different jurisdiction. Which Jerry was, in light of recent times, was struggling to make sure he didn't say any words that would offend President Higgins. We're allowed to say the Republic when we're drawing a distinction about the border and fracked gas, I think. But so we obviously don't want fracking anywhere on the island. Obviously the border, it is the same. Someone makes this point about the Shannon in the chat. It's the same shale bed on both sides of the border in Fermanagh and in Leitrim. So obviously, and the border, that doesn't respect any borders. So we're very much in solidarity with that campaign. We aren't actively working on it ourselves at Friends of the Earth or Stop Climate Chaos, really. But we can find out more over time about what our friends in the north are doing, and relay that to anyone who's interested. Now it's just coming up to 8 o'clock. Conor said to leave us. We said we'd finish at 8:15. There's a bunch of questions in the chat box which we will try and get to, and I want to bring Ciara back in. But Tom has it in terms of people who wanted to ask questions out loud. Tom has his hand up. Tom, over to you. We're not hearing you. You're off mute, Tom, but we're not hearing your voice. I see your mouth moving, but I can't hear you. I don't think anyone can hear Tom. Can you? No, Gary, no. Maybe type your question or mute and on. I'm going to mute you. If you unmute yourself again, see if that works. No, we're getting background noise, Tom, but we're not getting your voice, unfortunately. I'm afraid. Sorry. There's questions in the chat box from Irene about the SDGs, from Michael about building regs, from Mihal about local communities, from Letitia about what the responsibility for the local climate action plan. For local councils, what the responsibility of the climate action plan is. And Eric, you want to know, we're going to Glasgow like we went to Paris. I can take some of those, but Ciara, is there anything in there that you'd like to address, or any other issues that's been mentioned you want to come in on?
Sorry. With the building regs, there's just, I know from the policy that I mentioned in the presentation, there is actually a new, the building regs at the minute are quite high, I suppose, and there is a new policy thing that where the construction waste has to be taken into account. So there is, I don't know it exactly, but there is construction waste, and that aspect of it is covered in Housing for All. And I can share that document up, but yeah, so it is, I'm not an expert in housing, and I do know for the workshops a little while ago, I think Anya had Green Buildings Ireland or something, I can't remember. So there is that information, I think, within Stop Climate Case somewhere in the archives. So I can pop that in as well.
Could I just ask that I was really referring to the insulation issue, you know, because if the regulations aren't changed, we're going to have a whole new generation of really badly built houses in terms of the climate issues, which will have to be sort of re-insulated at some point in the future. So it seemed to be sensible to do it, to push for it now.
Jerry, I see you nodding. Yeah. I thought the building regs were not bad these days, but I don't know as much as you.
Yeah, I might not know as much as Michael either, but your point is a great one. And the one thing to look out for is that there is a piece of EU, I think it's a regulation on emission performance standards for buildings, and they have to be updated in light of the increased EU ambition and increased EU mitigation targets. And long story short, the updating of that EU legislation does imply that would trickle down to Ireland. But the point there is that Ireland needs to be supporting appropriate provisions and obligations in that piece of EU legislation. But your point, so that's from a legal perspective, and from an implementation perspective, your point is completely valid, and it's something we need to see in the climate action plan as well.
Yes, I see Anne from Kildare, who may know more than all of us, saying we are working to near zero buildings standards now. Is that what I understand, Anne, that our current building regs?
Yeah, I think they came in for public buildings in maybe 2018, and then, or maybe later, and then for all buildings the following year. I don't know a whole lot, never worked in that sector, but I educated an architect. So that's.
Thank you. That is my. That was my understanding too, that we actually, the regs got quite good in recent years, but at a time where there weren't very many houses being built. So, but hopefully they will apply now as we start to build houses, you would hope. Yeah. But obviously there's still a huge retrofitting challenge, Michael, and in terms of one of the issues that Ciara raised, a skills, like competition for skills, a competition for capacity to be able to do new builds while also retrofitting. So it is going to be challenging.
Sorry, Oisín, I think the buildings, the actual supply of construction materials is a huge problem at the moment. I hear most orders are only getting 10% of their ask. And I know our local council, actually, I live in Kildare, applied for just transition funds to update a lot of its housing stock, because we're in the Midlands, you know, that just transition area, but they're way behind. They just can't get supplies. Yeah, so I that's a huge challenge.
The different Tom Roach in the chat box, rightly asking where we're going to get, if we are using more timber frame, which would be good, where are we going to get, where are we going to get all the timber from, and will it be sustainably sourced? Because that's a challenge. So Jerry, I want to well, actually Tom's question was about, he's now written it in the box, and it's asking about is the new policy on the importation of gas only about fracked gas? You might clarify what's covered by that. And then there's a question about the link between the SDGs and climate change from climate action from Irene, which, given your previous hats, you might like to just touch on that as well, Jerry.
So Tom, I wrote in the chat box there, the policy that the government has in place is a moratorium on fracked gas imports and LNG. So I hope that answers your question. It doesn't relate to gas generally. And it's a moratorium pending the moratorium will remain in place until the government completes its review of energy security next year, and there's going to be a public consultation as part of that. So obviously we do not want, as part of that energy security review, any suggestion that we can continue developing fossil fuel infrastructure, be it LNG, fracked gas, or any type of fossil fuel, given our climate obligations. But that policy that I referred to is a useful, we hope it's a useful stepping stone. And then on the SDG side, unfortunately, over the past year, there hasn't really been any movement on SDG policy. And to explain a little bit more, there was an overarching, what's called a plan, but it was more like a report from government on back in 2018 on how it would implement the SDGs, but it wasn't particularly substantive. It didn't really include time-bound actions or commitments, or at least not that were particularly substantive. And the SDGs, to answer your question, is a really useful link for elevating climate action, both within government, across government, and with local government and in communities. But so it's definitely an important link. And thankfully, there is a commitment for government to produce a new SDG plan, and they consulted on that. There was a public consultation. Unfortunately, it was over the summer, so how many people saw it is another question. It was over the month of August, and we did feed into that and definitely made that link between climate and the SDGs. But the last point on that is there will be a stakeholder forum. There will be more opportunities to put our recommendations into the department as they develop that SDG plan.
Thanks, Jerry. I'm going to try to answer a couple of the questions in the chat box, and then sort of segue to what's happening next. Actually, before I say that, we will be kind of trying to frame these challenges and give you space in future workshops to think about them and think what your group might be like to be active on if you are in one future group. Because I feel when after this session, there's so many angles, there's so many opportunities, but also challenges and difficulties and questions that it could be a bit overwhelming. Climate change can be very overwhelming when it's just one big blob of we have to halve emissions, and when you see the extreme weather this summer. But it can be equally overwhelming when it's suddenly 100 different smaller policy things that have to get done. So we will be trying to work with you guys. We will be working with you guys to choose what are the 3 or 4 key opportunities for intervention, particularly by locally based campaign groups, that could make a big difference. Obviously, people are free then. Individuals are free to do whatever they like, and groups are free to do whatever they get most satisfaction from doing. But we'll be hoping to help not to tell you what to do, but to hoping to work with you to discern where are the things you can make most sense of and make most difference. And one of those maybe one of the options may be local council plans, because someone asked this in the chat box, what will they have to do under the action plan? So the National Climate Action Plan that comes out hopefully in the next month or so is really mostly national policy. But there is although it might have knock-on effects if it's about, for example, cycling infrastructure or whatever, there may be guidance or obligations or challenges to local councils to get more engaged from that, that may well flow from that national plan. But equally, under the new climate law, every local authority in Ireland has to come up, in the Republic, has to come up with a local climate action plan. So that may well be an opportunity for local One Future campaign groups to get stuck in there as advocates and as part of the public consultation to make sure that those action plans actually deliver for local people and make all those connections that Ciara was talking about in terms of rural transport and in terms of making the transition a socially fair one and a positive one, a healthy one for all of us. And we may get some of the rubber may really hit the road on some of those issues at the local level, and maybe one of the places where you can get active. And I want to come back to another issue that Micheál raised on local communities too, but just before I forget, Eric asked about Glasgow. So the UN conference and whether we'd be going to Glasgow the way we went to Paris, and I'll be brief on this. Basically, when it was announced 3 years ago now, probably, that Glasgow would host a COP, the immediate reaction of activists like those of us in Stop Climate Chaos was that this is the closest thing to an Irish COP we'd ever have, better even than if it was in London. You know, Glasgow, the train up to Belfast, or a bus up to Belfast, and a ferry across to from Larne to Stranraer, and off we go. And we would bring, you know, we would encourage hundreds or thousands of people to go from Ireland, the whole island, to Glasgow. Of course, COVID cancelled the whole thing last year, and has thrown the whole that dimension to it into a huge uncertainty this year as to whether or not it's possible for mass gatherings of civil society. It's also made access to that very unequal, as in unvaccinated people from the global south, who should be the ones whose voices are most amplified and most given a platform, are the ones least likely to have been vaccinated and find most difficulty in getting to Glasgow. So it's made it far more complex landscape for us. And in fact, many big international NGOs, including Friends of the Earth, have called for the whole COP to be postponed because of the lack of equal access, not just for civil society, but for nation states, smaller nation states, and their representatives as well. And of course, if we can't do, you know, vaccine justice properly, how are we going to do climate justice properly if we can? And of course, there's huge injustice currently with how vaccines are distributed around the world. If the COP will go ahead, many NGOs will feel, including Friends of the Earth, it's better that some of us are, not necessarily, I don't mean me, but some, that we're there because of the other lack of access, to make sure that we represent those messages anyway. But it has complicated the landscape. And it means certainly, as Friends of the Earth, Stop Climate Chaos has made no final decision on this, and they are meeting tomorrow to talk about it. As Friends of the Earth, we are not going to be organising to bring or to encourage people directly to go to Glasgow. We'll be encouraging our supporters, and to the extent that we talk to one future groups, as we are now, saying maybe decentralised actions in your local area. On the 6th of November is the Global Day of Action, Saturday the 6th of November, that maybe there's things we can be doing here around Ireland in solidarity with action on climate, rather than going to Glasgow. But of course, people are free to go to Glasgow themselves, and other members of Stop Climate Chaos may decide they want to encourage supporters to go or facilitate that, and we will feed back once we know. We actually just don't know what the other members of Stop Climate Chaos are thinking yet. Once we know, we will feed that back. So it's 30 minutes past. I wanted to do two things. One is, Micheál asked about up in the chat about engaging local communities on what they can do locally, and not just in terms of campaigning, but in terms and individuals, but in terms of reducing emissions. And Friends of the Earth in particular, we've tended not to do a lot of that ourselves, because of limited capacity, and because the thing we say most often to individuals is, don't just be an individual, join to get together, join with others. And the most important thing an individual can do is talk to the politician and demand policy change, because we need to make the zero polluting options affordable and accessible for everybody, rather than just encouraging lots of individuals to make emissions reductions. But of course, there is a value to doing that too. And Mary Robinson's, or our paraphrasing of Mary Robinson's word on this, is get personal, get angry, get together and get involved. As in, if you do something personal yourself about reducing emissions, it makes it more real for you. And so it is worth communicating around that. We as Friends of the Earth don't have any ready-made resources on that right now. We may well develop them for the reasons that they are in demand, and other organizations may have them, and we'll try to share them when we get a chance. But that's all I can say about that for now. And so finally, it's 1:15. This has been a whistle-stop tour of the very diverse and complex landscape that we are entering into as we actually try to reduce emissions. The good news is we have more to hold on to than ever before. The climate law is a really strong structure. It's not perfect, but it is a really strong structure, and it does actually address one of the issues that someone else raised there on lobbying. It doesn't mean that lobbying by big business and by big polluters will be like null and void. They will vocalize very strongly, I'm sure, but it does level the playing field. It makes it a bit more like, I hope, the playing field we've had over the last 18 months around public health emergency, that the government will listen to the science and the evidence more likely to than they will to fossil fuel or other big interests who want to delay or dilute action as they have in the past. But it's the rules of the game that have changed. We still have to play the game. We still have to make the case for action and try to outweigh the impact of lobbyists. Before my voice completely goes, excuse me. So that we've had this whistle-stop tour now. We'll now move into a couple of sessions next week and the week after about your group, if you are part of a group, and not everybody here is, and we'd invite you to come along next week. You have the link already for next week. It's the same as this week. as a stepping stone to joining groups. And there'll definitely be breakout sessions in next week's session. And the week after, we'll do a session where we actually break out into geographic groups based on where you are, to try to help the One Future groups get going after the summer break and after the break since the spring, and plan about whether you want to do actions around the COP, whether you want to do actions around bringing TDs together, like we talked about last week in town halls, and what support you need to do that, bearing in mind that there's a limited amount of central support right now because we're still replacing Anya and Sive, but we definitely try to produce the basic resources you need to help you run a town hall, or to help you do some sort of solidarity action on the 6th of November. They're the kind of short-term options, but also looking forward to whether you want to engage on transport locally, or the local authority plan, or what other issues are on fracking. What are the other issues out there, and how we can point you to the resources to help you do that. But that's they're the next steps. There'll be less talking from the likes of me, you'll be glad to know, and more talking from all of you guys next week and beyond. And I'm sorry if we've missed any of the questions in the final messages, but that's all we have time for tonight. So thank you all very much. And we will see many of you hopefully next week. It's next Monday, if I'm just double check that. Yes, it's next Monday at 6 o'clock is the workshop facilitated by Labo about how to have a healthy and effective and sustainable group. So thank you all very much indeed. And thanks to Ciara and Jerry and Conor for coming in and sharing their expertise on the paths ahead.